the core issues of art. So as we are beginning this course on art appreciation, it's a pretty important question to ask ourselves, what is art? Some of us might have been looking at art and taking some art classes for years and feel like we've got a handle on this subject. But a lot of us really haven't had very much exposure in our high schools or in our general culture. And when we go to museums and we see the range of works from paintings to abstract paintings to huge hyper-realistic sculptures like this one, or large-scale installations like this one, it's such a range of work that it can be hard to decide, well, what is art if all of these things are a part of it? So I'm going to show you some images, and we're going to play a little bit of a game called Is It Art? Why or Why Not? In each of the following slides, you'll be shown a pair of images and asked to consider which are works of art. For each pair, you may decide that both images, neither, or just one of the images are what you would call art. Very importantly, consider why you think as you do. Jot down all of your thoughts on a separate sheet of paper, and these will help you later in writing your response to this lecture. Our first pair. On the left is an image of a life-size marble sculpture, and on the right is a small reproduction of the same sculpture. Are either of these art? Why or why not? Jot down your thoughts. Be as specific as possible, and press pause here if you need a few more moments. Our second pair. On the left is an oil painting, and on the right is a postcard of the same painting on which someone has drawn a mustache and the letters LHOOQ at the bottom. Are either of these art? Why or why not? Our third pair. On the left is a photograph of an arrangement of red leaves, and on the right is a picture of a leaf I found in my yard. Are either of these art, or both of them, or neither of them? Why or why not? And lastly, on the left is an ancient vase, and on the right is a mug with a printed logo. Are either of these art? Why or why not? Again, press pause if you need more time. Okay, let's talk through these. So in our first pair, our first image was the life-size marble sculpture. And I would guess that most of you had said, yes, this is in fact an artwork. So what were your reasons? It might have been that you thought the skill and technique was impressive. And certainly it is, that you could take something like a hard stone like marble and make it into this very realistic human figure on a life-size scale where we can see the furrow in his brow and the way he's biting his lip and the layers and pieces of his hair and the sense of motion in his overall body. The skill and technique is very impressive. Some of you might have also mentioned that the material felt like a true art material because marble is very traditional to art. We also might have been very impressed by the originality of this piece in comparison with the reproduction. Some of you might have said yes, that the souvenir was also an artwork. Oftentimes, people will note that it seems, that not everyone can own the original piece, both because of its price and its large size, but that it's a beautiful thing if everybody can have a replica of an artwork. And so we want to say yes, that it is. And those are great motives, but really within the fine art world, we would say that this is an art replica or an art reproduction rather than saying it's an artwork in and of itself, right? So we tend to value originality of form, meaning the original way it looks, and also originality of content, meaning the original significance or meaning of the piece, are things that we tend to value. With our second pair, again, I would think that most of you probably said yes when you saw this image of an oil painting, and most of you even recognized that it was the Mona Lisa by Da Vinci. You might have said, again, that skill and technique factored into your decision that it was an artwork. You might have thought also, again, that materials were important, that it was an oil painting, and that feels like a serious or traditional material. And some of us might have also said that the authority of the art world played in. The idea that whether you like this painting or not, you have seen it your whole life. You've seen it in reproduction in magazines. You've seen it on The Simpsons and South Park. It has been reproduced and played into so many different facets of our wider media that it would be pretty tough to say no and disqualify it as an artwork. So most of us said yes to this one. Now, what about its pair? A postcard of the Mona Lisa from the early 1900s, on which a man named Marcel Duchamp scribbled a goatee and mustache and the letters LHOOQ. Now, many of you might have wanted to say no at first. This couldn't be an artwork because it is unskilled. And that is definitely true, that anyone could take a postcard and scribble a mustache and goatee and letters on it. So we are definitely not impressed with the skill and technique, or the originality of form in this case. It's not original. But Duchamp was an artist, and he did have artistic intentions and original content when he was making this piece. He was really trying to be playful, but had an important message to deliver. So if we look a little closer, he's taken an artwork that is hailed by all of Western tradition since the Renaissance, has thought of the Mona Lisa as this very important artwork. So he's taken this almost sacred artwork in that sense and defiled it. So it's a pretty bold thing to do, really. He's put the goatee and the mustache on, but he's also written the letters LHOOQ at the bottom. Now, if we try to pronounce that phonetically in English, it almost sounds like look, right? Like he's telling us to look. And apparently, if you pronounce it letter by letter in French, it makes out a sentence that basically means she's got a hot butt, right? It's a very cheeky phrase to write at the bottom of this sacred image. But if we start to push a little further, we might actually get some content out of it that we can understand and can respect. So we might even ask questions like this. So he has defiled this image in a way, but the postcard itself was so poor anyway, right? I mean, if we look at the original, the postcard is such a bad reproduction. Isn't that also kind of tearing down the respect for the original? Or we can look at how the Mona Lisa is often reproduced in our culture on light switch plates like on the left, or t-shirts on the right, or napkins or bedspreads and umbrellas. And is that really how we treat something that we actually have a high respect for? I think Duchamp wants to point out that this image that we say we respect, it at the time of his work is already 400 years old, and it's been kept in such high regards, but life is so different now than it was in the Renaissance, and maybe art needs to move on too. So I think he's sort of trying to challenge the Renaissance tradition and say that we need to move on into a new direction. And if that doesn't convince you, we can also say that, again, the authority of the art world has something to say about it. This is a piece that many galleries and museums have displayed, many art books have also displayed, and mark it as a turning point, an important turning point for the rest of the 20th century art world that kind of took a cue from this idea. Our third pair was this one of the red leaves and the leaf I brought in from my yard. And this one by Andy Goldsworthy, we would say is in fact an artwork. Now, again, the skill and technique may not impress us a lot at first. Perhaps we feel like we can arrange leaves like this. But it is also made by an artist, so it has an artistic intent. That is, that he wasn't just bored on a picnic day and, arranged leaves for passing the time, but that he actually created it to be seen and to be contemplated. And in a sense, it has twofold of artwork. It is the actual sculpture that he created with the leaves, but then also the photograph is also an artwork in and of itself. Goldsworthy has made a lot of work out in the wilderness, out in nature. These are two more works. The one on the left, an arrangement, again, by color or value of the stones. And on the right, one that perhaps might impress us more in terms of skill and technique as well, this arrangement of sticks is actually arranged in a lake so that the upper half of the image is what is pouring or standing above the water, and the lower half of this circle is actually the reflection on the water. Do you see that? You can tell a bit at the bottom that it's actually the reflection. So a pretty kind of sly, interesting move there with connecting the top physical part and the lower reflected part. It's also worth noting that Goldsworthy uses only natural materials. So in banding these sticks together, he's actually using pieces of grass, strips of bark, or even weaving the branches, sort of whittling them together and making them stay against one another. Lastly, the second part of that pair, we have this leaf from my garden. And most of you probably said, no, it's not an artwork. I am an artist, but I wasn't really intending it as an artwork. I was just observing life around me. A few of you might have said yes, and oftentimes people will say that nature is God's artwork. And certainly when we look around us, many of us feel the presence of God in the world around us, in even the designs of leaves like this one. For the purposes of our class, and usually with discussing fine arts, we're talking about works that are actually man-made. So it is definitely a beautiful metaphor to think about all of creation as the artwork of God. But when we're talking about artwork in the academic setting, we're really looking at things that are man-made, human-made. Okay, our last pair. We have an ancient Grecian vase, this one here, and also this mug from the NPR program Card Talk. Now, most of you were probably inclined to say that this one was an artwork. Many of you might have said, well, it's very ancient. We know we've seen things like this in art museums. We're impressed by the hand painting on the vase of these figures, Ajax and Achilles playing chess. And so we want to say, yes, that must be an artwork. We also assume that because it's before industrialization that it was handmade, and so we usually are impressed by that. The mug, we were likely to say, no, probably wasn't an artwork because it was mass-produced, factory-produced, mostly made for kind of commercial purposes, sort of to propagate the reputation of Card Talk. Well, there's some interesting things to note here. So as we're making our list of core issues, we do tend to prefer things to be handmade over factory-made, or at least individually made, even if machinery is involved, over things that are mass-produced. That does tend to be an issue that we come back to again and again. But it might be interesting also to note that with the ancient Grecian artistic system, this wasn't just the inspired work of a single artist. It was actually, most of these vases, which were very popular and very common, were made by a whole workshop of artists. So one craftsman might make the body of the vase, and he'd pass that on. Somebody else would add the handles and pass that on. Someone else would add the foot of the vessel and pass it on. And then lastly, Exekias would take the vase in this case, and actually he was known for painting these particular kinds of scenes. There's only a handful of Grecian craftsmen that we know by name, and Exekias happens to be one of them. So that, for some of us, will shift our idea. If we know that it's not an inspired work by just one artist, but it was actually a conglomerate of different craftspeople putting it together, and that even though it wasn't factory produced, in a sense it was mass produced, right? They made hundreds of these. One other thing that can perplex our conversation about these objects is also the idea of utility. So most often when you go to an art museum, you're looking at things that are made for contemplation and not for using, not for putting your hands on, pouring your coffee in. This Card Talk mug is obviously used for coffee or tea. The Grecian vase is actually also a utilitarian vessel. They actually would have stored, depending on the size, they had specific sizes and shapes that they would use for grains, for wine, for funerary urns. And so they were actually utilitarian vessels. Now, the big difference between these two, or another big difference between these two, is the age. So because the Grecian urns or vases are so old, we really value them and want to protect them. And so we do move them into our fine art museums, even though a similar artwork made today might have quite a harder chance of getting into those museums. the big factor here is that factor of utility, that most of the time today, things that are of utilitarian value are not considered works of fine art. We think of fine art as being things made for contemplation. So, we're going to see over the course of our discussions that the idea of art has changed greatly. So, the idea changes greatly from one era or culture to another. But these same issues seem to come up again and again. These are the issues that we've come up with. So, skill and technique is a factor, expression and content, originality of form, and form means the physical appearance of an artwork. So get familiar with that idea. Form means the physical appearance of a artwork. Originality of content or concept, what it means to us. Materials. So depending on the culture, there are materials like marble and oil paints that seem very traditional materials. Mass production. In general today, we tend to like things that are one of a kind, but we'll see that often changes in society, that we'll see some societies that use mass production and it's not a problem at all for their artworks. We do value the intent of the artist, both just the bare idea that they've made it as an artwork, and also we do tend to like to know the particular idea. The authority of the art world. Has this artwork been approved by gallerists and curators and fine art museums and put into art books? Have the art auctions said, yes, this is a valuable piece of art? That should matter a little bit to us. Just like in any discipline, if you get into the higher world of math or the higher world of the sciences, we would listen to those scientists and those mathematicians. We should care somewhat about what the art world says about its discipline. And then lastly, the utilitarian function. In today's world, we tend to think of fine arts as something for contemplation. Then there are the decorative arts or applied arts, which are things that are both functional and also beautiful. We might lump in graphic design into that, which is used for marketing and advertising, and yet is beautifully designed or interestingly designed, like your CD covers, your posters, etc. And then functional objects that are really not particularly aesthetically pleasing, but are functional. Think about a lot of your tools, perhaps. Get very familiar with this list of the core issues of art. We're going to come back to these throughout our discussions, just as sort of touchstones to see that even as the definition of art changes, these issues are going to be the ones that recur time and again. So get very familiar with this list. Especially, pause here for a moment and jot down some ideas. Which 2 or 3 of these issues do you value the most? Do you value skill the most? Do you value the original content? Something new is being said? Do you really like applied arts? Do you really like something that is functional? Take a moment to jot these down. To test out this idea, imagine what types of artworks are most likely to make you stop and take notice. What qualities would you consider would make you consider buying a work of art? Or what characteristics are likely to inspire you to look again and again at the same artwork? As we trace the changes in the idea of art through various eras and cultures, we can ask, which of these core issues did they prioritize? I'm going to note just 3 significant landmarks in the changing idea of art, and we'll get to discuss these more further on in the course. But for today, just 3 significant landmarks. The first one is before the Renaissance. So we're looking at Western tradition in the ancient world to the pre-Renaissance. So before about 1500, the art world tended to prioritize in this way. So they really valued skill and technique, and it was very narrowly defined. We'll look at an example in a moment. The artist's intent was almost insignificant. In fact, we know very few artist names from the pre-Renaissance and the ancient eras. It really was not about a specific artist or their personal expression. It was really about them expressing the culture. So, for the Egyptians, what were they saying about the Egyptian gods, about the Egyptian pharaohs? It wasn't about how did that artist feel on that particular day. right? So it's expression, but it's a cultural expression. The arts and crafts were integrated in most cultures before the Renaissance. So whether it was a painting, a sculpture, or let's say an embroidered robe for a priest or a king, those things were seen as equal artworks. They weren't separated from fine arts and crafts. Also, in terms of mass production, the workshop was the common model, that most artists did not work alone, but they had a whole workshop of craftspeople, and they would each do a part of the work. There might be a master craftsman who directed the work, but they all had largely equal standing in the workshop. And here's two examples from the Egyptian culture, where large groups of artists were working together, and the stylization stayed the same for about 3,000 years. So it wasn't about each artist interpreting the world in a unique way. But you wanted to, the pharaoh, statues of the pharaoh needed to be a certain height, certain proportions, certain stance was common. And the same in this example on the right from the pre-Renaissance. In the medieval era, there was a standardization of what images of the Madonna and the Christ child should look like, what the halos should look like, the colors that the different saints should wear. And so each artist would conform to these standards. So cultural expression, not personal. And this was the narrow definition of skill within each culture. In the Renaissance and after, we see a shift. Originality of form and concept gain significance. So we want to see something new, and we want to be told something new. Along with the artist's intent and personal expression. So suddenly, when we get to the Renaissance, we can begin to name Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Donatello, all kinds of different artists come to mind as individuals with individual style, because suddenly we care about originality of form and concept, the artist's intent, and their personal expression, along with the cultural expression. So most artists in the Renaissance are still doing Christian artworks because that's the dominant worldview, but they will put their personal spin on it. Additionally, we start to see artists not just as everyday workers, but we start to see them as geniuses, as divinely inspired. There's also begins to be this persona for the artist as sort of moody and melancholy, but as a member of high society. Previously, they were just craftspeople, sort of blue-collar workers. And at this point, some artists become elevated members of society. It's also at the Renaissance that we see the separation of the fine arts from utilitarian objects, which become known as crafts. So that's right around 1500 we're going to mark for this big change. Here's one example. Michelangelo's very famous Pietà, an image of the Virgin Mary with the dead Christ across her lap, a very solemn image. What's interesting here is Michelangelo is not the first to do a Pietà. Many people had it before and after would do this image of Mary with the dead Christ. However, he did it in a very unique way, a very original way. He made the Mary much younger than previously had been typical. And so she had a different sort of relatability to the people. He also did it much more naturalistically or realistically than a lot of previous artists had. And so there's also that where you can see the veins in Christ's hands or the way the fabric across her legs folds. And so it's a very moving piece. And all the way up to the 20th century art that tends to very much value originality of form and concept, where each artist feels like they really need to have their own signature style. If you're familiar with art, you would look at this piece and right away you would know that Roberto Matta had to have done it because it's his signature style. So in Egypt, no one had a signature style. Everyone was a part of the same stylization. But nowadays, it's important for every artist to do something new, to try to do something new. And our last landmark here is 20th century and today. What is going on in art is that originality of form and content are the most highly valued. So we want to see something new, we want to be told a new message, but we still want to tie to tradition. So we want there to be some connection to past artists, some sense of the lineage of art, but we like new things, right? Materials and technique Basically, anything goes as long as it adds to the meaning of the work. So you will see things that are highly skilled, highly polished and refined and beautiful, impressive in their skill and technique, and maybe using traditional materials. But you can also find works that are made of toothpaste, let's say, or things that are like the arrangement of leaves that might not seem that difficult. But as long as what the material and the skill does, it needs to add to the meaning of the work in the modern era. And in terms of mass production, in the Renaissance, we saw people wanting to make things by hand and uniquely, so Michelangelo did his own work. But today we actually see some people bringing back the workshop. People like Murakami or Jeff Koons actually have hundreds of people working for them, helping them to make their work, because they have so many ideas and so many commissions that they come up with the ideas, but they let other people actually do a lot of the physical work. And yet the finished product is actually sold and displayed under the artist's name, since they came up with the concept and approved all of the making of the pieces. It's a lot more like an architect who designs the building but doesn't actually construct it. One example is of material choices, might be this one by Janine Antony, where she sculpted busts, that's a head and shoulder portrait of herself, on the left out of chocolate and on the right out of soap. And after they were cast and then formed, she actually interacted with each. She would nibble and lick on the chocolate and actually wash herself with the soap. And she was interested in this idea of identity, how we picture and understand ourselves, how we interact with ourselves, how we try to, maybe in some cases we need to sort of baby ourselves and protect ourselves, nourish ourselves, and cleanse ourselves, but ways that those same practices can also change us and mold us. And this was part of a larger exhibit where she had a whole series of these busts that were exhibited in Venice. So while these are non-traditional materials, the fact that it is chocolate or that it is soap adds to the meaning of the piece. If she had just made them out of marble or bronze, they wouldn't be as interesting and dynamic of pieces, right? So the material and the skill and technique needs to feed into the meaning of the piece. With the 20th century and today, it's interesting to notice that there's a huge increase in the number of distinct art movements. Previously, an art movement might last for 100 years or more, and yet now, just in the last 100 of years, we've probably had more than 20 different distinct art movements. With these changing priorities in the fine arts, we can also see that those relate to other aspects of culture. So if you think about how many new movements in art there have been, think about how we love novelty as a culture. I mean, you have probably had, let's see, how many cell phones have you owned in the last 5 years? Maybe 2, 3, 4. Some of you have had one almost every year. Or how many cars your family has owned in your lifetime. Things like that. We tend to be a culture that really likes new things. We always want the latest and the best. And that carries over into art as well, that we're always trying to come up with some new idea in the arts. But I think it's really important to remember that art is always connected to culture. Even if the art seems to be something strange or something weird that you're unfamiliar with, ask yourself, how does this relate to the culture around us or around the artist? All right. How do we approach understanding artworks, especially if they don't match our personal tastes? That can be tricky, and we want to be able to approach artworks regardless of whether we like them immediately or not. So we're going to tackle this question in our lecture on approaches to art. For today, your online journal in response to this lecture, I want you to answer these questions. Use your notes to help you. Did any of the works of art surprise you or challenge you in your concept of art? Why and how? Were there any issues you came up with which weren't on our list of core issues? If so, what? What are the 2 or 3 core issues that you value most in the fine arts? Give me some examples. So if you value skill and technique, tell me an artwork that you really value for that reason. And lastly, which 2 or 3 do you value least? Or you could say, which types of art do you feel by which you are confused or turned off. So I just am interested in getting to know kind of where you stand at this point, what things draw you in and what things repel you in the art that you know of so far.